Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Bob Beecher, and I'm CEO of MPTF. And welcome to today's MPTF webinar talking about suicide. Today's webinar is one in a series that we've produced over the past few years and made available to our entertainment community. Although each of them has been on an important topic around holistic wellness, none of them are as significant as this one when we talk about matters that truly are about life and death. We're fortunate to have one of the directors of MPTF Social Services Program, Jennifer George, and Clinical Psychologist, Dr. Lisa Firestone, as the hosts for our panels today. Again, the title is Talking About Suicide. So we hope to hear from many of you as well during this webinar through the chat box. In one way or another, I suspect that all of us have been impacted by suicide through family or friends or other connections. And I also suspect that it has been one of your own personal worries, as it has been mine about the same cohort of people. Suicide is so pervasively part of our zeitgeist today that it comes to mind, sometimes the front of mind or sometimes just the back of mind, when we witness behavior, hear words, feel thoughts that seem too dark, too hopeless, too abjectly negative. And then what do we do with that worry? I think that among other things, that's what we're going to explore today with Jennifer and Dr. Firestone. For me, it begins first with empathy, to sense that something isn't right, then with the courage to be willing to say something or do something, and then having the tools, which we're going to learn more about today, to feel empowered to move forward with confidence and clarity. Now I want to introduce Jennifer George. Again, Jen is one of the directors of community social services programs at MPTF and a licensed clinical social worker. Jen has been an amazing colleague of ours for 14 years. Her day-to-day responsibilities include management and oversight of the community social services program, the Comedian's Family Fund, MPTF's evidence-based and educational programming, such as Powerful Tool for Caregivers, LGBTQ inclusivity training, as well as MPTF's geriatric social work internship program, which seeks to train future social workers and leaders in the field. We can only hope that the future social workers are at the same high standard as the incredible social work team we have at MPTF. Over to you, Jen.
Thank you, Bob, for your introduction. And thank you for everyone for being here today and for the team that's put together today's webinar. The genesis for today's webinar on suicide arose from a number of conversations that we as providers of care were having here at MPTF around the topic of mental health, the experiences that we were having, as well as the experiences of those of who we serve. Concurrently, we were learning about almost what felt like on a day-to-day basis of suicides that have been occurring in our entertainment community and abroad. And so we launched into action to seek out an expert who could take on this very challenging topic and take it out of the shadows and to provide us with some tools and resources. It's my privilege today to introduce Dr. Lisa Firestone, PhD. She is a clinical psychologist in private practice and the Director of Research and Education at the Glendon Association and Senior Editor at PsychAlive. Since 1987, she's been involved in clinical training and applied research in the areas of suicide and violence. This research has resulted in the development of 4 assessments: the Firestone Assessment on Self-Destructive Thoughts, the Firestone Assessment on Suicide Intent, and the Firestone Assessment on Violent Thoughts for Adults and Adolescents. Dr. Firestone is also the co-author of Self Under Siege, Conquer Your Critical Inner Voice, Creating a Life of Meaning and Compassion, and Sex and Love in Intimate Relationships, as well as numerous articles and chapters. Dr. Firestone is a nationally recognized and internationally recognized speaker on the topic of suicide, violence, and family relations. She's also the producer of the Glendon Association training films on suicide and violence. Dr. Firestone, thank you so much for being here today.
Well, thank you for having me. I am going to share my screen and put up a PowerPoint just to provide some initial information about suicide. We're going to talk about what we need to know to help save a life. I think it's a very important topic. I think this is a situation that is affecting many of us. And I also think that it's a difficult topic. So I appreciate the people who have joined today and want to learn about this, because I think it is a difficult topic to talk about. I think it's important to recognize that every 40 seconds a life is lost to suicide, which means that each year we lose around 1 million people worldwide to suicide. That in the United States, that the rate has increased by 30% since 1999, and that suicide claims more lives than all wars, murders, and natural disasters combined. So as human beings, we're most in danger from ourselves. We think about being in danger from others, but we're in danger from ourselves. And for every person who dies by suicide, there's 20 more who attempt. So suicide is kind of just the tip of the iceberg of this problem. There's a lot below the water, if you will. These are kind of the suicide rates over years. You can see in the most recent data we have is for 2020 that the rate did go down during the pandemic. I think that the concern is that post-pandemic, if there is to be such a thing, that we probably will see an increase. And even with the fact that people are no longer isolated, I think the isolating and the pressures of that we had, an unprecedented circumstances that we've all been through, I think was particularly hard on some populations, even more than others, but it was difficult for everybody. What's going on inside somebody who's suicidal? There's something that's called the suicidal mode. And when somebody's in the suicidal mode, it's like they have blinders on. They're not seeing other alternatives. So when you're in a regular state, you might see other alternatives to suicide to solve problems. When somebody really gets those blinders on, it's very hard for them to see. And, what is the suicidal mode? It's experienced as mental pain, this driving push, because it feels unbearable. And it may be temporarily unbearable. We've all gone through some temporarily unbearable times, but it doesn't feel temporary to people when they're feeling suicidal. It feels like it's always going to be this way. Some of the feelings are strong feelings, often of anger, anxiety, embarrassment, humiliation, and shame. Those are often some of the strong emotions, and desperation to do something about these very strong, painful emotions. There are also dissociative symptoms that happen. That means that the person is feeling like they're outside of themselves. They're feeling emotionally numb often, detached from their body, and indifferent to physical pain. Maybe very sensitive to psychological pain, like a hurt from somebody else, but not very much in connection with their body, which makes suicide possible. And some people have more propensity towards dissociating. If you've suffered a lot of abuse early in your life, you've learned to disconnect and not be in your body, and that makes the risk worse. So it's one of the important things is helping people get back in touch with their own body. The cognitive system, or the way people are thinking when they're suicidal, is what we call the suicidal belief system. And often people are experiencing core beliefs like feeling helpless, like I can't do anything about my problems, feeling unlovable, like I don't deserve to live, or I'm worthless. Or somebody I spoke to yesterday said, it would just solve all my problems to be dead. That's the feeling, that this is the solution to the problem. And it makes logical sense to the person at the time. And that's an important thing to realize. Suicide is an action that makes sense to the person at the time. Even though it may not make sense to their loved ones, other people around them who see their good traits, that's not what the person is seeing at that moment. That's not their experience. So how does suicide occur? There's usually some underlying vulnerability. It could be having a mood disorder, substance abuse issue, a tendency toward aggression, anxiety, a family history of suicide. In terms of sexual orientation, the issue is not that people with different sexual orientations have more risk. It's that if you're being treated badly around your orientation or how you present yourself, or being bullied or unaccepted, especially by people close to you, that's when you're at higher risk. So it's not something inherent to do with any particular orientation. It's about feeling like you don't fit in, or like you're going to be persecuted in some way for who you are. Abnormal serotonin levels, that has to do with a brain chemical that is decided by a couple things. First of all, conception, you get some kind of genetic predisposition towards serotonin levels, but you also, if you've had abuse in your childhood, you're going to have lower serotonin levels for life, and that can make you more at risk for suicide, as can adverse childhood events. This is a literature that we've only known about, I don't know, maybe in the last 15 years, originally stemming out of some research that came out of Kaiser of San Diego. But when people have more adverse childhood events, they're at higher risk for a number of both physical and mental health conditions. And one of those is suicide. So, how many adverse childhood events you've had also affects things. Then there's stressful events. There's usually a trigger for people that triggers that suicidal mode. It could be an underlying condition that are related to some of these underlying vulnerabilities, like you have a substance abuse problem, so you lose a job. That leads to more humiliation and shame, and it just starts to steamroll. It could be something that's experienced as being humiliated, a loss, a recent loss. People can adjust to almost any loss, but in that initial adjustment period, they really can be, troubled. So then there's acute mood changes, anxiety, dread, hopelessness, anger, and as I mentioned earlier, desperation to somehow get rid of those very painful feelings. And then there are things that can happen in the environment that are inhibiting of suicide, like if there's a strong taboo against suicide in your community and your family, if there's available support, if you can slow down your mental state, that works to help alleviate the suicidal mode. If there's other people around, that lessens your risk. If there's spirituality, religiosity, or some kind of meaning in life, and it doesn't have to be any particular prescribed meaning in life, if you have your own sense of a meaning in life, that's protective or inhibiting of a suicide. There's also things that can be facilitating of a suicide, like a weak taboo, or a method or weapon being easily available. This is why when somebody's at risk, we want to get easy access to methods restricted for that individual. It's why we put barriers up on bridges. It's why in states that have stricter gun laws, there's less suicides. And when they loosen those gun laws, suicides go up. And when they increase gun laws, suicides go down, because guns are the main method used in the United States. A recent example, this can be in your community, in your direct, family or close friends, or it can be in the media. And how the media presents that, especially if it's glorified in any way, it can lead to something called contagion that I'll talk a little bit more about later. Being in a state of excitation or agitation increases risk and can facilitate suicide. A very agitated state. When you have tools or methods for calming yourself down, you're much less likely to take your own life. And also being alone, being isolated. People who live in more isolated areas have higher rates of suicide. People who live in areas with more gun ownership have higher rates of suicide. And this inhibition or facilitation in the environment can mean the difference between survival and somebody losing their life to suicide. So obviously what we're going to try to learn today is some skills for helping the people who help inhibit, who help, even somebody who may be struggling with all these other things to not lose their life to suicide. So, often suicide is considered a symptom of mental health condition, but not all people who die by suicide have a diagnosed mental health condition. And I just want to be really clear about that. There's a lot of different stressors that contribute to suicide risk. So in a recent study, they found that 42% of people who did not have a mental health condition who died by suicide had a relationship problem. Relationship problems are often a trigger, feeling lost, feeling rejected, feeling like nobody's ever going to love you because a relationship is ending. 29% had a crisis in the previous or upcoming 2 weeks. and a problematic substance abuse was often increasing for that person. The most dangerous drug when it comes to suicide is the very legal drug, alcohol. Alcohol facilitates aggression. It facilitates aggression towards self. So 60% of murders that happen in this country happen under the influence of alcohol. 50% of murder victims, by the way, are also under the influence of alcohol. And suicides, at least 50%, happen under the influence of alcohol. So it doesn't have to be that somebody has a long-term alcohol problem, just adding alcohol in the mix makes suicide more likely. Having a physical health problem, and it's often early in diagnosis that people get suicidal, feeling helpless or hopeless. We can learn to live with almost anything. It's that learning to live with period. Sick for 6 months that are the most problematic. And job or financial problems, 16%. Now you can see how some of these things may have been escalated by the crisis that we've been in with the pandemic. Often a lot of people have more financial and job problems going on, and also the rising inflation we're suffering. Substance abuse went up during the pandemic. We know that, especially alcohol use. It put a lot of stress on relationships. It led to some crises, and it caused a lot of physical health problems, especially for people dealing with long COVID or somebody who's lost a family member to COVID. So, you know, this is all increased by this current situation. Also, having criminal or legal problems also can contribute to suicide risk, including just the threat of a potential arrest can, for some people, trigger a state of desperation. And loss of housing. And that's another thing that's been added to with the pandemic is loss of housing. So there are two things, the main things that go into the desire for suicide. This is the Thomas Joyner's model from his book, Why People Die by Suicide. It's called the Interpersonal Theory of Suicide. And the idea is that two things contribute to the desire for suicide. One is perceived burdensomeness, feeling like you're a burden to others. People would be better off without you. Somebody who's thinking like that is going to be at higher risk. And feeling like you don't belong, something called thwarted belongingness, or feeling like you don't fit in. Now, other people might not see you that way. Your family might not, your friends, but the person themselves is seeing themselves that way. And there also has to be this capability for suicide. He used to call it the acquired capability because he thought it was systematic desensitization to pain. But it turns out it also can be something to do with your temperament that you're born with. But this capability, some people have the capability to take their own life and some people don't. I think it has a lot to do with that disassociation, that ability to disconnect from yourself physically. It's very hard to kill yourself if you're very connected to yourself physically. And you have to have all of these things in place, actually, for somebody to make a serious attempt or end up dying by suicide. And again, it's not some realistic evaluation of these things, it's the person's experience of these things. So we have to get into their world and understand what they're experiencing to really know. And this really led to this 3-step theory of suicide, which comes from David Klonsky and his colleagues. And the idea is there's 3 basic things that we got to evaluate. Are you in pain and feeling hopeless? If you're not very likely to feel suicidal. But if you're in extreme emotional pain and feeling hopeless, you're much more likely to feel suicidal. 2, is your pain greater than your sense of connectedness? If you have a strong sense of connection, and so no to this question, you're only going to have moderate ideation. But if your pain is greater than your connectedness, you're probably going to have strong ideation. And then the third question is, are you capable of attempting suicide, which has to do with your nervous system and that desensitization to pain and all of that. If you have low capability, you're going to have ideation only. If you have ideation and you are capable, you're probably going to have a suicide attempt. Prior attempts make it easier, by the way, for future attempts. So if somebody has done this before, this is like, you think about a mountain with snow on it and you're going to ski down it for the first time, you know, there's no path. But once you create a path, it's easier to go down that same path. And when a person has a prior attempt, it gets easier, and it can quite quickly escalate from very minor, not life-threatening attempts to very life-threatening attempts. So it's important to pay attention to those changes. I think about a 14-year-old girl in our community who initially took a small amount of aspirin, told her mother right away, got her stomach pumped, no big deal. Second time she jumped off the cliff, broke almost every bone in her body. So it can escalate quite quickly into a much more lethal suicide attempt. So, we're sort of charting two things here. There's our desire for suicide, which we all have at one time or another. It may go up and down. It's not a steady thing. So it's something that has to be, this is why we have to reassess risk regularly for suicide, because it waxes and wanes, right? On a really bad day, it goes up. On a really good day, it goes down. But and then there's our threshold for attempting suicide. How bad would things have to get for us to take our own life? And it's when our desire exceeds that threshold. And that threshold could be on the decline because a lot of negative events have happened in your life or a lot of stresses are happening. And it's only in that moment here that we get a suicide attempt, right? But if you block somebody from making an attempt in that moment when their desire exceeds their threshold, what happens is their suicide risk goes down again. And you have time to work with somebody. They have time to get help. Things could get better. So what we need to do is help people not have access to means or, be able to not have support during these moments when their desire exceeds that threshold. So what are the risk factors we need to look for? Mental health conditions is a risk factor. The number one mental health condition is some form of a mood disorder, major depressive disorder or bipolar disorder. Substance use problems are also a big part of this. Bipolar disorder, schizophrenia are all mentioned. Personality traits like aggression, mood changes, and poor relationships. Conduct disorder, anxiety disorders, serious physical health conditions, including extreme pain or chronic pain, and traumatic brain injury. This is one of the reasons why we're losing more soldiers to suicide than we are to combat, is partly because of traumatic brain injury, which is not an uncommon kind of injury in the current kind of conflicts that our soldiers are fighting in. Environmental factors includes access to lethal means, including firearms. The problem with firearms is they're just so incredibly lethal, and all it takes is 1 second of intent. If somebody takes an overdose, they could die if they take a lethal overdose, but there's time for them to change their mind and reach out for help. There's time for a person to find them and intervene. When somebody uses a firearm, there just is no time. We don't have that time to intervene. We don't have that time for them to change their mind. This is why, in these mass shooting events that we have in the United States, so many more people die if there's a firearm involved, right? It's just, you can do a lot of damage in a little bit of time with very little intent. Prolonged stress, such as harassment or bullying, increases risk, and relationship problems or unemployment. We've talked about stressful life events, and exposure to another person's suicide, especially graphic or sensationalized accounts of a suicide, actually increase the risk. They increase the risk for people who are in the zone. They don't increase the risk for everybody. They increase the risk for people who are in that zone anyways. So after Marilyn Monroe died by suicide, and it was quite publicized in very dramatized ways, there was an increase in risk. There was increased suicide rate that summer, and then there was less suicides in the next months after that. It's like anybody who was in the zone did it. And then there wasn't as many people in that zone. But it does increase the risk for those people. Historical factors have to do with things that can't change, unfortunately, like previous attempts, family history of suicide or childhood abuse, neglect, or trauma. So warning signs, if the person is talking about suicide, talking about feeling hopeless, feeling like they have no reason to live, they're a burden to others, they feel trapped or unbearable pain, we need to pay attention. Behaviors we might see are looking for a person trying to acquire the means for suicide. Their Google for history does matter. Withdrawing from activities, isolating from family and friends. And often people don't put this together. They just feel like, oh, they don't like me anymore, or they're pulling away from me. They don't connect with all their other circle and see that they're also pulling away from everybody. Sleeping too much or too little. And I would emphasize the too little. Sleep is probably the #1 warning sign that you'll see. They're not sleeping. When we don't sleep, we make bad decisions. We get more impulsive, we get more aggressive. It increases the risk for suicide. Visiting or calling people to say goodbye, giving away prized possessions, more aggression, more fatigue, more risk-taking. And the mood things that we see, again, depression, anxiety, loss of interest in anything that used to give them pleasure, humiliation and shame, or relief and sudden improvement. They're suddenly looking better, It might be because they've come up with what they think is the perfect solution, which is suicide, which is not, I don't believe, the perfect solution to anything, but at the moment it may look like that to the individual. Here's the protective things that we should try to increase in people's lives: access to mental health services, feeling connected to family and community support, so reaching out to that person you're worried about, making sure they know you care, problem solving and coping skills. This is what the person needs to help learn how to regulate their emotions and how to tolerate strong negative emotions. These are the skills that suicidal people, while very different and unique to themselves, need to learn. They have this in common. They have trouble tolerating strong emotion and they have trouble regulating it. Limit access to lethal means. Just make them have to go out and get those pills or buy those bullets. That amount of time, often they don't feel like doing it anymore. They're not in that moment where their desire is through their threshold. Anything that puts time between the person and their plan, anything that, teaching people how to procrastinate their suicide saves lives. Just put it off. You could always do it tomorrow. Cultural and religious beliefs that encourage connection and help and make a person feel like they're valuable or they matter. And it could be they have to stay alive for their dog or their cat. That's great. Just make sure that dog or cat sticks around. It reinforces their reasons for living, whatever they are. What you can do: talk to friends, be the one who will listen and help. This was a campaign that was done by our national Lifeline, the 1-800-273-TALK number, which soon will change to being the 3-digit number. But be the one. Most people who are suicidal and get through it do because of their friends. Us in the mental health field want to think it's because of us, and sometimes we do help, but it's friends who make the biggest difference. Friends, family members, people who care. The person you're willing to stop and talk to on the street is crying. It doesn't even have to be a friend. It can be a stranger, the person who smiled at them. Be the one who will listen and help. So what are the 5 steps that you need to do with somebody who's at risk? You need to ask. You need to be willing to ask about suicide directly. Don't be afraid to talk about it. It's when we don't talk about it that people die. We've been trying not talking about it for a long time. It has not led to less suicides. We need to ask people, have you thought about hurting yourself? Have you thought about suicide? We need to open that conversation. We need to keep them safe. We need to stay with them until we get them to help and get them to good help. We just need to be there and be with them. Helping them feel connected matters. Keeping them safe also might be helping get, pills out of the house or a gun out of the house or whatever it might be. Help them connect to resources that are really going to help. Help them get to good help. That really matters. And follow up. And, if you're worried about somebody and you're not sure, call the National Lifeline. They will talk you through. It, and they will help you connect to your friend or the person you care about. They also have a chat function if you don't like using the phone. And, there's a crisis chat line as well. These resources really matter. And with young people, the chat line is way more popular than the phone. So chat matters, and adding that service has been a really important improvement to our national Lifeline. Media plays an important role, and I know many of you are in this field, so I just thought I should mention to you that there have been hundreds of studies worldwide that have found that contagion is real. There's also the reverse is true, by the way. If you show a story or tell a story, especially well, about somebody who's been suicidal and lived and now has a good life, that's also suicide preventive. That's something called the Papageno effect. The contagion is called the Werther effect because there was a novel written in England many, many years ago when people were reading more novels, where about a young man who dies by suicide, and the rate of suicide went up among young men. When we tell the opposite kind of story of somebody who's been there but gotten better, people also do well. And if you want a great website to send somebody to who is feeling suicidal, you might send them to a website called Live Through This. It was created by Desiree Stage. She actually goes and takes portraits of people who've had prior suicide attempts and has them tell their story about their attempt, but also about their recovery and about their life worth living now. And that's really important. So Live Through This is an important resource. Research indicates the duration, frequency, and prominence are the most influential factors that increase suicide contagion. A show like 13 Reasons Why that showed a lot of a young girl who had died by suicide, getting to go back and blame all these different people who had something to do with it actually increased the risk amount, especially among young girls. We've got to think about these things and how they affect people. Covering suicide carefully can change perception and dispel myths, inform the public on these complex issues, and it can really be helpful. But and when there are media reports that are done well and that share resources, help seeking goes up. People do call more, they do reach out more. So things to avoid, I'm just going to put these up there, describing suicide methods in detail, keeping it to the general location is better, share content of suicide notes, no report that a note was found, describing personal details about the person who died. Don't aggrandize this or make it something to people to live up to get attention. Presenting suicide as a common or acceptable response to hardship is problematic. It's important to report that when people get coping skills or support, most people can get through these kind of crises. Oversimplifying it or speculating on the reason is not helpful. Describing warning signs and what people can look for to help friends, much more helpful. Sensationalizing it versus reporting on just the facts. Being sensitive, especially to grieving family. Glamorizing or romanticizing suicide as instead of providing context. And overstating the problem by using descriptives like epidemic or skyrocketing, scare people and make people more likely to do it, saying, here's our best available data. And yes, it is increasing, or whatever. Prominent placement of stories related to suicide death in print or newscasts, increased risk. Place or print the article inside or not, glaring at people is more helpful. So, and again, tell stories of people who survived also. So whenever our local media reports on it, our information officer makes sure that they include something about hope for the future, somebody who survived and has done well, and resources. Those are the things we want in those kind of stories. So when people have had suicidality, when they've made a past attempt, how do we help keep them safe? What we do know works is something called a crisis response plan or a safety plan. They're really equivalent. It's a memory aid of things that helped the person before and could help them again in emotional crisis. It's a checklist of personalized strategies, what works for this person when they've been in crisis before. Because if you just say general things that help, they may not align with that person. What has helped them before? It's a problem-solving tool when somebody's in crisis, and it is a collaboratively developed strategy for managing periods of high risk when that desire is going up above their threshold. There are 6 steps to it. First, have the person describe what are their personal warning signs. How can they tell when they're getting into trouble? It may be that they're getting more agitated. It may be that they're not sleeping. It may be that they're having ruminating thoughts. Whatever it is, how can they recognize? Because once they're in the mode, it's hard to get out of it. If they can stop it before they get there, they're going to do much better. What are the internal coping strategies they have that work for them? It could be going for a run. It could be petting their dog. It could be taking a hot bath or a cold shower, whatever helps them calm down. Baking brownies, doesn't matter. What are their strategies that they can use to help them remember when they're in that mode and they can't think? What are the social contexts they could use that would help distract them from these suicidal thoughts, and it might even offer support? Who are the people they can reach out to? They need to have those numbers and how to contact those people easily at hand. Are there any family members who can that they can talk to about the crisis and that can be helpful? And it could be family members, it could be good friends, whoever works for them. Who are the professionals in their life who might be able to help? And, number for their case manager, their psychologist, their psychiatrist, whoever, agencies, and, reduce the access to lethal means for this individual. Make sure they have the 1-800-273-TALK number, because that's available 24/7. There is a safety planning app that you can get on your phone. This is something to walk through with somebody you're concerned about. I know we had a question prior to the webinar about somebody who's worried about their son. This is something you might want to do with them. I can't give direct clinical advice. I don't know your son, but I do think that getting this app and helping them walk through this and getting these things on their phone which they always have with them, especially if they're a young person. We actually have a body map in our brain that thinks our phone is part of our body at this point. We feel like we can't survive if it's not right there. Really important to have this easily at hand for people. It turns out just doing this, even if the person never looks at it again, is helpful. It reduces suicide risk. As a standalone intervention, it reduces suicide by 40%. And we can all do this. You don't have to be a trained professional to do this with somebody, but all professionals should be trained to know how to do this. And not all are, unfortunately, but we should be doing this safety planning. It is the standard of care at this point in our profession. What are the therapies that work for suicide? First of all, what are the treatments that work have in common? They are suicide specific. They're not, we used to think, okay, this person has depression, we'll treat their depression, they'll get less suicidal. You know what? We don't have time for that. We've got to target suicide specifics and focus in on that, reduce their suicidality, then we can treat their depression. That should be the order. The number one thing, this person has to be alive for treatment to work of any other kind. Targeting their substance abuse disorder, great, but let's target their suicidality first. This has to be number one and center focus. It's not just a symptom. It is a pervasive thing separate from a diagnosis. Being empathetic and collaborative in your approach matters. As the introduction said, empathy matters. Try to see what it looks like from that person's perspective and why suicide might seem like a reasonable option to them. Be collaborative in the process of trying to get them help. Carrying contact, following up with people matters. Help the person form strategies for themselves, know their personalized warning signs, and use a safety plan or a crisis response plan. All of the treatments that work have these things in common. Carrying contacts, or even after the person leaves treatment, we're going to follow up with them. Because the first thing we knew worked for suicide prevention was the postcard study, where people got a postcard once a month. And you know what? In the postcard group, there was no suicides after people had left the hospital after having made a medically serious suicide attempt. And it was just a postcard, not a very expensive intervention. These are the therapies that have research behind them. From my colleague, David Jobs, we have the collaborative assessment and management of suicide. If you're looking for a therapist for somebody you're concerned about, this would be a therapist who has training in this would be a good fit. Cognitive behavior therapy for suicide prevention. This is taking cognitive behavioral therapy, which has been adapted to many different things, and adapting it specifically to suicide. It's different. Dialectic behavioral therapy is a therapy developed by Marsha Linehan and has been shown to be helpful for suicide. Attachment-based family therapy. Prolonged grief therapy for people who are experiencing grief. Brief cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a version of the suicide prevention kind of therapy that has been developed and tailored to our military personnel. And the ASIP program, this was developed by my Swiss colleague, Conrad Mikkel. It is an intervention that was done in the hospital after a suicide attempt that was done. It's just 4 times of meeting with the person, and it reduces suicide reattempts by 80%. Pretty impressive. There's a manual out from the American Psychological Association publishing on ASIP, and actually these other treatments as well. I want to share with you our approach, and I think it will help you get an inside picture of what's going on for people who are suicide. We believe each person is divided, all of us, not just people at risk for suicide, but everybody. And that we have a real self or a positive self that is life-affirming and goal-directed, but we also have an anti-self that is critical toward ourselves, and at its ultimate end could be suicidal. So there's this part of us that wants to live and is life-affirming, but there's part of us self-critical, self-hating, its ultimate end can be self-destructive. Any of us can go down this path with enough stress. Second part to our approach is that negative thoughts people experience exist on a continuum, from mild self-critical thoughts that we all have at one time or another to extremely suicidal thoughts. There's also a continuum of self-destructive behaviors people might engage in, everything from just limiting their life to isolating themselves, to extreme self-hatred, to substance abuse, risk-taking to actual suicide. And our contention is that there's a relationship between these two continuums, that how a person is thinking has a lot to do with how they're likely to behave. So there's events that can act as triggers. for suicide, like loss of a relationship. But the filter through which we see that loss is through our thoughts. So if we think this was my soulmate, and nobody's ever going to love me now, this means I'm unlovable, it proves it, then we're going to have very distressing feelings. Those distressing feelings are going to make those thoughts seem more true, and we're likely to get self-destructive behaviors. If we have a breakup of a relationship and we think, you know what, that was not a very healthy relationship, I'm going to have a better relationship in the future, then that's not very likely to lead to that cycle. So that filter of our thoughts has a lot to do with how we're likely to feel, how we're likely to behave. So what do I mean by those thoughts? The critical inner voice is something that we've written a lot about and talked about quite a bit. It refers to a well-integrated pattern that we all have to some degree of destructive thoughts toward ourselves. And the voices that make up this internalized dialogue are at the root of much of our maladaptive behavior. This internal enemy, if you will, fosters inwardness, distrust, self-criticism, self-denial, addictions, and a retreat from goal-directed activity. It affects every aspect of our lives, our self-esteem and confidence, our relationships, but especially our likelihood to engage in self-destructive behavior. The ways that we're turned against ourselves, the way we internalize negative feelings and beliefs about ourselves, especially those kind of core beliefs like I'm unlovable, I don't matter. If you think about it in terms of ourself and our anti-self, we're going to use Max here from Where the Wild Things Are, one of my favorite children's books. When you give into your negative thoughts, when you isolate yourself more or feel more self-hating or ruminate on your self-hating thoughts, you're feeding this monster that lives inside of you. It takes more and more control over your life, and you're more likely to act self-destructively. What you want to learn how to do is what Max did at the end of Where the Wild Things Are, where, you know, he said he wanted to go home and they said, don't go, we'll eat you up, we love you so. And he said, I'm going to go anyways. When you choose yourself, when you do life-affirming behaviors, you actually starve the monster. You shrink your critical inner voice. Now, first, it's going to throw a tantrum, just like the monsters did, you know, showing their terror, you know, their claws and grinding their teeth or whatever it was. But, you know, that, you know, if you stick with it and get through it, you actually take more control over your life and your life goes in a more life-affirming direction. We wrote about this in our book, Conquer Your Critical Inner Voice. There's a few exercises here from that book that I'm sharing with you. But the idea of taming self-attacks instead of I'm this or I'm that into you statements, you are this or you're that, starting to separate that very negative point of view as an overlay on your personality rather than just believing the negative thoughts about yourself is helpful. Another helpful thing is to write down your negative thoughts in the second person, just stream of consciousness, and then come back to it and write a more realistic, compassionate point of view from your own point of view. That's I statements. You know, so I struggle with things, but usually if I try really hard, I do really well, you know, whatever, a more realistic, compassionate idea. And then really to look at the actions that you take in your life today that are based on your critical inner voice and what would reflect your real self. And to really look at increasing and making a plan to act on your real self so that you grow your sense of self and decrease the power this critical voice has over you rather than the opposite of feeding it. So what are the do's and don'ts if we're going to try to intervene in suicide? So first, the do's. Be aware. Listen to your friends. Be willing to think that your family member might hurt themselves. That's why I really value this question about the person's son who feels hopeless. It's important to pay attention to the fact that you're alarmed and to do something about it. Learn the warning signs, pay attention. Get involved, become available, show interest and support. It really matters. Ask if the person's thinking about suicide. Be willing to talk about it. Don't make this a taboo subject. That hasn't worked. Be direct, talk openly and freely about suicide. Be somebody that it's okay to talk to about it. The main reason people don't talk to anybody about it is because they're afraid. They don't feel like their friends or family want to hear it. And sometimes it's really hard to hear that, right, from somebody we really care about. But if you would be willing to listen and allow them to express some of the strong feelings they're having and accept their feelings while disagreeing with their solution to the problem, but allow them to have their feelings, their anger, their pain, and sit with it, the more they can express it, the less there are going to be that push for those feelings to drive self-destructive behavior. And be non-judgmental. Don't debate with the person whether it's right or wrong to kill themselves or good or bad. that doesn't help. Don't lecture on the value of life. Just accept that this is something they're struggling with and help them get to help. So, I understand why you might feel this way, but let's see if we could do anything that would help you to feel different. Let's give that a shot first, because there's no coming back from this. Offer hope that alternatives are available and take action. So if you're worried about your son, get him into therapy. Make sure that it's a therapist that he connects with, that he feels like he can be himself with. That's what's going to matter. And that maybe somebody who has the appropriate training. There's a question about people who are manipulative around suicide. Some people are manipulative around it, but the reality is that those who are manipulative also lose their life to suicide. We used to think there was those who were manipulative and those who were serious. It's not true. People can cry wolf a lot of times and still be very serious. We need to pay attention. Because there was a question about that as well. What are the don'ts? Don't dare the person to do it. Now that may seem completely obvious, but people get frustrated and say things like, if you're gonna, if you talk about this all the time, why don't you just do it already? And unfortunately, that can feel like you're siding with that anti-self. You don't want to side with the anti-self. You want to do everything you can to connect with the part of the person that wants to live, and you don't want to side with their anti-self. You don't want to ask why. Why would you do this? Why encourages defensiveness? As human beings, we're not very good at why questions. They put us on the defensive. Why did you do this? Why did you do that? We just feel interrogated and we shut down, and we may answer, but it may have nothing to do with the truth, because we're just in a defensive mode, right? It's not helpful. Asking about how they're feeling is one thing. Asking about why is another. It's not helpful. Offer empathy with the feelings, but not sympathy with the solution. Don't sympathize with the solution of suicide, but offer empathy with the feelings. I understand how you could feel this bad. Let's see if there's anything else that can help. Don't act shocked. If you act shocked or like, how could you say that? Or, don't talk about that. You just shut the person down. They learn you're one person not to talk to. That's not who you want to be. Don't be sworn to secrecy, because that will just make you feel very isolated, and it will put you under a lot of stress. Seek support. Your friend might be angry at you at first for telling somebody else, but at least they'll be angry and alive, right? And that's important. That's more important than, being sworn to secrecy and then they die. And then you feel like, oh no, I should have told somebody. You should have got them help. Better to get help. So what are some of the common emotions that we're going to experience when there is a loss to suicide? I'm going to talk about these because being a survivor, a person who's lost a loved one to suicide, puts you at greater risk yourself. So let's think about what these feelings are. And this is true for people in my profession as well as true for everybody. These are things people are likely to feel when there's a sudden death, and especially a suicide. Shock, guilt, despair, stress, rejection, confusion, helplessness, denial, anger. We're angry at the person who did it, but we want to blame somebody else because it feels really uncomfortable to, when the murderer and the victim are the same person, we don't feel like we can be angry at the murderer. If a murderer killed somebody you loved, you'd be clearly angry at the murderer. But when it's the same person as the victim, we don't know what to do with that anger. So we want to blame somebody. Families often want to blame mental health professionals. Mental health professionals want to blame families. Blame is not helpful in general. It doesn't solve anything. But the anger is, we're angry and we don't know where to put it. Disbelief, sadness. We also do a lot of self-blame. We may feel lonely or abandoned. Like the person chose to leave me. People do not make this choice for suicide. They're in the suicidal mode. They're not making a rational choice weighing pros and cons. That's not what's happening. It looks logical to them in the moment, but not because they're seeing themselves through a clear filter. So, blaming ourselves is not helpful. And everything, in hindsight is 20/20, and it's not in foresight. So we don't always know that what the person was saying was goodbye, or, that it was some kind of ending. Afterwards, it may look that way. The fact that they came by that day, or they gave us back that loan that we gave them or whatever, might look very different the next day than it does the day before. So these are just some of the feelings: pain, shame, hopelessness, numbness, abandonment. It's important to recognize that we're going to have these feelings, and these are normal reactions. And what we may need is help, support to get through those feelings. The most helpful thing I've seen for survivors is going to support groups with other survivors who've had loss of family members or loved ones to suicide. They exist all over the country. We can access them. They are very important. If you're having trouble finding them, please feel free to reach out to our organization, or the American Association of Suicidology also has a list of resources on their website. The International Suicide Prevention Organization also has, and I'll show you, I have links to those websites in my last slide. That would be important. Things to do to take care of ourselves. This was another question that came in. If we are dealing with somebody who is suicidal, that we're worried about, that we love, or that we're caring for professionally, or whatever it might be, we need to keep ourselves healthy. So it's okay to seek help and take care of ourselves. So it's okay to ask others for help and support. We need to do that, and we need to model that for the person we're concerned about. We need to talk to other people and deal with our feelings about what we're going through. We need to get plenty of rest. This is the one I always say that I fail at. I got better during the pandemic when I wasn't coming into work, but that's fading. I'm getting, but sleep, get enough rest, take care of yourself that way. Drink plenty of water, avoid caffeine or other stimulants to try to buoy yourself up, or don't resort to alcohol or drugs to deal with your stress. This is not helpful for the person who's suicidal. It's not helpful for you either in the long run. It may alleviate some of the feelings momentarily, but it often makes things worse. Exercise, on the other hand, is great. The side effect is you get healthier. But having something that helps you release your stress is really important. Relaxation skills yourself. You might want to employ more of whatever helps you relax. That could be meditation, or it could be hiking in the wilderness. It could be whatever it takes. Take care of yourself. Don't forget about your own mental health. And you want to have self-compassion. This is what we want more for people who are suicidal and for all of us. And this way of looking at self-compassion comes from ancient Buddhism, but it's also really been researched by Kristen Neff. It's called being touched by and not avoiding your suffering. Suffering is part of the human condition, right? We're all going to have suffering if we're going to be alive. And it's not trying to avoid that, but being kind to ourselves when we suffer. So self-compassion is not based on an evaluation of ourselves as good or bad. We're not good because we've had a success, or bad because we've had a failure. It's just being kind to yourself and treating yourself the way you would treat a good friend. We're all, most of us, pretty good at treating good friends well. We're not very good at treating ourselves well. We're not nearly as kind to ourselves. We tell ourselves a lot of pretty mean things. And there's three elements to self-compassion. One is self-kindness versus self-judgment. We need to be able to have mindfulness and be able to take a step back rather than over-identifying with our thoughts and feelings, letting them flow through us rather than getting too attached to them, and having a sense of our common humanity. Often when we suffer, we feel like it's just us. And the reality is it's all human suffering. We have to take our suffering as a sign that we're more like other people than different, and have a sense of our common humanity. We're all in the same boat, even though it might be a sinking boat, if you will. Our National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is a great resource. Again, they'll talk you or a friend through helping someone. They'll talk directly to the person. They're available 24/7. This is soon to be a 3-digit number. That is not in implementation yet, so I'm still going to give you the 1-800-273 talk number. They also have a chat service. They have lots of good resources. They have more on that. Be the one to help your friend. In an immediate crisis, if somebody is threatening to hurt or kill themselves, or is looking for a way to hurt themselves, call 911 and seek immediate help. Don't wait. Go ahead and do that immediately. Okay, there we go. On our website, we have webinars about this that you can access with lots of good experts in the field that have been archived, as well as we'll have a new one in September. National Suicide Prevention Month. These are some great resources, our national hotline, our website, the National Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention, the American Association of Suicidology's Survivor Support Group that I mentioned, the International Association of Suicide Prevention has worldwide resources that are listed by country. These are some of the books and films that we have developed. We have a film on preventing suicide for the general public. We have one for professionals for training, and we have Faces of Suicide, which was made during the making of the suicide quilt in our local community. where people tell their stories of loss and how they got through a loved one's suicide. And here's how you can contact us. So this is our organization and information on our website, PsychAlive. We also have a lot of good resources for suicide prevention. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to whether we've had any questions that have come in. I think I've addressed the ones beforehand. You know, it is the one thing I would say a little bit more about is that, you know, when somebody is telling you as the only one they're telling they're suicidal and they're not telling anyone else, that's really difficult. And I feel for your stress if you're the person who wrote that question. And seek support for yourself because it's hard. And, you know, we can't force other people to be honest, but we can try to get this person to help. And you need to get support for yourself because that's a really heavy burden. And there are people who will tell you the truth, but they won't tell anybody else. And that's really difficult. They won't tell their, you know, closest family member, or they won't reach out and tell somebody else who might be more helpful, or the therapist they may be lying to about it. If you're a family member and you're worried about it and you want to call the therapist, go ahead and call their loved one's therapist. That therapist can't even confirm for you that they're seeing their loved one without a signed release if they're over 18, but they can listen. And what I tell therapists is listen. When family members or loved ones call, roommates, friends, it doesn't matter. Listen, because you know what? They probably know more than you do about the person's day-to-day, and you will get information that's valuable. So, you know, you can tell them, I can't tell you anything, but I can listen. So if you'd like to tell me anything, please feel free and make time for those things. They're important.
Thank you, Dr. Firestone. We have a couple minutes and a few questions did come in the chat. I'll just read them to you verbatim. The first one was early on, and the question is, as a department head, what is the best way to communicate to my team that there are resources available to them without anyone feeling like they are being singled out?
Yeah, I think just bringing up the subject and saying, you know, I just want you to know our department has resources and here's some ways you could get help if you ever need it. And, you know, not just for yourself, but a family member or a loved one. People are often willing to talk about a family member or a loved one, sometimes as a guise for themselves, but also sometimes because they really are dealing with a family member or a loved one they're worried about. Make the resources available. Just say, this is something that might be important to you at some point in your life. Keep these numbers just in case, or these websites in mind, just in case. And here's some resources. And I just think normalizing it is something that people often feel at one point or another in their life. 80% of people in shopping malls will say they've thought about it at some point. So let's realize that this is not uncommon, and let's talk about it and bring it out of the closet. So bringing it to people's attention that you have resources for your department is a really valuable thing to do.
Excellent. One more question. When you were talking about not asking why, incredible point about don't ask why and put someone on the defensive, but humans are also curious beings. When is it okay to ask why, or is there a different path for that question?
I think it's just trying to understand how they're feeling is the best path. I don't think why is ever a great question for us. I know we want answers a lot. We start asking why from the time we can talk. Drives parents crazy. But, you know, we do want to know why things happen. We are curious, but people aren't good at explaining their behavior. But we can ask about their feelings. And if we understand their feelings and try to get into their history and their perspective, we can start to understand why in their mind it might look like a good solution. So we can empathize with the wish without sympathizing with it as a solution. We can understand how they may have gotten there. And actually people sharing their story of how they got there will make them feel cared about, listened to, and is a great first step as a friend or as a professional to helping somebody who's suicidal. So listening to their story of how they got there. So asking, sitting back and really listening and not interrupting is the best thing you can do.
Thank you so much. I think we're at our time. So we would, some folks have asked, you know, how to access this presentation. We'll be working on finding ways to get this out to everybody. So stay tuned for that. Dr. Firestone, on behalf of everyone here at MPTF, we just want to thank you for your time and for this very important conversation, as well as to your team that helped you to get here and to the team here at MPTF who have put this webinar together. We want to thank them as well. And most importantly, for everybody who's attended today and who has soaked up this rich information, we hope that you'll pay it forward and share this with your colleagues, loved ones, and family members. Thank you all for today.
You're welcome, and I thank everybody for being here.